among all the elements that can characterize the Second World War, there is one that, without a doubt, stands out above all the others, and is at the top of the list. We are referring to the famous German Tiger-type battle tank, which went into action for the first time at the end of 1942, being at that time the most advanced armored vehicle in the world. The popularity and notoriety that this battle tank achieved was not comparable to that of any other, even creating the so-called Tiger phobia, which was basically a state of panic in which the Allied crews could enter when they had to face against an armored vehicle of this type. Although this myth is evidently fueled in part by war propaganda, it is an irrefutable fact that this battle tank performed actions that until now were believed to be impossible. In today's program, we are going to see the history of the two most lethal heavy panzer battalions in the entire German army, these being the 502nd and 503rd Battalions. As we will now see, the first of them reached the figure of 1,400 enemy armored vehicles killed, and the second reached 1,700. The origin of these units is located during the summer of 1942, this being the moment in which the first heavy battalions were created. At first, the idea was that these units should be made up of about 25 Tigers and another 25 Panzers III, the task of the former being to confront the enemy tanks taking advantage of their superiority, while the Panzers III would act as support, carrying out exploration and reconnaissance tasks. The objective was to create a small, very powerful, and flexible formation, capable of providing support in those most critical places on the front. A few months later, in March 1943, the number of Tigers assigned to these heavy battalions rose to 45. As they were independent units, not attached to any particular division, their main task was to move towards enemy penetration points to strengthen them and contain the enemy advance. Before starting with the history of the 502nd Battalion, we have to say finally that many of these units were being re-equipped starting in the summer of 1944, with Tiger II type battle tanks, but their structure and assigned missions were maintained. Given these issues, let's start with what was the unit with the best numbers of the entire contest. As we have said previously, this formation reached the figure of 1,400 enemy casualties, due to the loss of only 107 Tigers, which gives us a casualty ratio of more than 13-1. The history of the 502nd Heavy Battalion begins on May 25, 1942, at which time it was formed, but it was not until mid-August when the unit received its first 4 Tigers. They were quickly sent to the Leningrad area, where this new tank made its first appearance on the Eastern Front. The battalion's first steps were quite difficult, because its crews had practically had no time to train with the armored vehicle and, since it was new, it had many mechanical failures to correct. To give us an idea, of the first batch of 4 Tigers sent to Leningrad, 3 of them broke down between the route of the station where they had been unloaded, and their concentration area. Little by little, they arrived in the area with more armor, until 2 companies could be formed, the second company being sent urgently to the outskirts of Rostov, to stop the Soviet advance of January 1943. It was here, where this unit went fully into action against the Soviet tanks, wreaking havoc wherever they fought. On the other hand, the first company that was still in the Leningrad sector was also fighting fiercely to contain the Soviet Polar Star offensive. After weeks of intense combat, the front calmed little by little, and as of March it was stabilized. This battalion had had very good performances, but had been very worn out, so it took advantage of these months until July to recover. The main advantage that the new Tiger tank offered to the Germans was the ability to shoot down Soviet armor at much greater distances than any other tank in their arsenal could to date. Additionally, due to its advanced optics, the Tiger had lethal aim. This new situation forced the Soviets to have to launch their armored vehicles in an accelerated and hectic manner against the German panzer formations, with the aim of closing the distance that separated them as soon as possible. As is normal, this maneuver made them make many mistakes for which they paid dearly. The 502nd Battalion continued fighting during the end of 1943 around Leningrad, stopping all Soviet offensives in the area, until finally, at the beginning of 1944, they had to retreat. At the end of February, the 502nd helped establish the new German defensive line on the Narva River, at which time they only had 17 Tigers. There, he continued fighting in a series of defensive battles until in July, they were overwhelmed by the various Soviet offensives. It was specifically on September 26, when the battalion reached the mark of 1,000 enemy armor destroyed in its combats near Riga. Shortly later, part of the unit was isolated in the Curonian pocket, although its members would be evacuated and sent to Germany to be re-equipped with Tiger IIs. At the beginning of January, the 502nd Battalion was reconstituted as the 511th and was located in East Prussia. Once the Soviets launched their offensive on the Vistula, the unit was mainly focused on the fighting around the city of Königsberg, and little by little it succumbed, while continuing to wreak havoc among the Soviet armor. In addition to this sector, his 3rd Company was assigned to the Ruhr Basin, for which it was reinforced with 8 new Tiger IIs, and it was there where it would finally surrender in April 1945. As we said at the beginning, this unit ended the war with a total of 1,400 tanks killed and losses of 107, giving us a ratio of 13-1. As a final curiosity, it was precisely in this battalion that the famous Otto fought. Carius, contributing more than 100 victories to the formation, and it was also in said unit where a Tiger was lost for the first time in the Leningrad sector, which was quickly captured and studied by the Soviets. Having already analyzed the 502nd Battalion, let's now move on to see which was the most lethal battalion, not the most effective. This is explained because while the 502nd managed to shoot down 1,400 enemy armored vehicles, the 503rd reached the figure of 1,700. However, it suffered losses of 252 Tigers in total, giving us a ratio of 6.75-1. The history of this Heavy Panzer Battalion began on April 16, 1942, the day it was established. The first peculiarity of the unit is that it was not formed with normal replacement personnel, but rather veterans from different panzer divisions were assigned to it. The first destination for the 503rd Battalion was assigned to them while they were training, and it was North Africa. However, due to how critical the situation on the Eastern Front was becoming, they were sent there at the end of 1942. Their mission was to keep a corridor free in the vicinity of Rostov, which would allow the withdrawal of all German divisions, who were retreating from the Caucasus. After a month and a half of hard fighting, the battalion had been depleted, and was sent to the rear to recover and re-equip. Once it was ready again at the end of April, with its full 45 Tigers, it was under Manstein's orders to participate in the Citadel operation over Kursk. The different companies of the battalion, which comprised about 15 Tigers each, were divided into different divisions of the Southern Pincer, and began the offensive on July 5. These armored vehicles were of great help when it came to overcoming the defensive lines, and in direct confrontation with the continuous battle tanks that the Soviets sent to stop the German advance. Once the offensive failed, the Tigers of the 503rd were involved in a series of defensive combats that little by little pushed them towards the Dnieper. When the battalion arrived on the banks of this river at the end of 1943, it had lost all its Tigers, so it had to be re-equipped by the beginning of 1944, with another 45 newly arrived Tigers. It was in these first months of 1944 when the unit became subordinated to other larger formations, but it was also when it stood out the most in its combats against the Soviet armored groups. During that month of February alone, the figure of more than 600 enemy tanks destroyed was credited. By March and April 1944, the Soviet avalanche was overwhelming, and the situation became more and more critical, to the point that Manstein himself was dismissed and Walter Model was put in his place. After having been severely decimated in these combats, the remaining men of the 503rd were sent to Germany to be reinforced and re-equipped with 45 Tiger IIs. Later, in July of that same year, they would fight in the Normandy area, in an attempt to keep the front stable. After weeks of combat, in which the unit lost many armor to air raids, what little remained of the battalion had to be sent back to Germany in September to recover. After new training, the 503rd with another 45 Tiger IIs was sent to Hungary, in an attempt to keep the country under German control. There they would later go on to fight in the rescue attempts of the city of Budapest. From there, they had no choice but to retreat little by little in the direction of Vienna, and later towards Prague, with fewer and fewer operational tanks. Despite having hardly any fuel or ammunition, what remains of the battalion continued to cause casualties to the Soviets as late as April 13th and 19th, in which the last Tigers of the battalion shot down more than 30 Soviet armored vehicles. On April 28th, the unit's most famous figure, Panzer Ace Kurt Nispel, fell in combat while covering the retreat to the west of the remains of his battalion. On May 10th, the 400 men remaining from the 503rd managed to reach American lines and surrender to them, although a few days later, they were placed under Soviet control. In addition to Nispel, other famous men of this unit were Heinz Rondorf, who scored 106 enemy armor destroyed, and Heinz Gardner, who achieved the figure of 103. As we said at the beginning, the unit's total count during its years of combat was 1,700 enemy casualties for 252 losses. However, let us not think that all German heavy battalions performed equally well. To give an example, the 508th Battalion managed to destroy only 100 enemy armored vehicles for 78 losses, or the 504th reached the mark of 250 killed for 109 losses. The total ratio of all heavy battalions of this type, in which we also included those of the Waffen SS, was 5.74 tanks destroyed for each of their own.